How 30 years of neglect occurs in a classic Mercedes. This is kind of an interesting topic that I've been examining. We'll say I've been examining this topic for a long time, because I try very hard to understand how problems occur on these cars that, you know, people like me have to spend so much time rectifying. And you know, I've been studying, like, my long-term success of some of my major sorting projects. And what I usually see after those projects are complete is the beginning of another 30-year cycle of neglect. So what exactly am I referring to? Well, we'll put it this way, okay? About 30% of our customers that have their cars sorted by us will bring those cars back on time for their next subsequent oil change. We're not talking about, oh, I have the oil changed regularly. I mean, we'll say our local customers in Central Florida will either change their oil or get an oil service done within a reasonable period of time. We're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 miles. To me, this is like ridiculous that you'd spend all this time and money sorting out a car. And, you know, I think a lot of people have this attitude of once the car's sorted, they don't even need to change the oil anymore. They're like, oh, I just spent 20 grand on my car. Do I really need to get an oil change? Or some other ones, do I really need to lubricate the front suspension if you have a swing axle car and you have the 14 grease points up front? Or do I really need to get my valves adjusted? I mean, I just spent all this money on the car. You know, and I think the funny thing is that people think that because they've rectified a 30-year cycle of neglect, and I specifically refer to this as a 30-year cycle of neglect for reasons that I'll explain in a second, but they go, oh, I've rectified all this stuff from a 30-year-old cycle of neglect. Why not just start the 30-year cycle of neglect all over again? Instead of saying, okay, well, I've managed to get all this stuff fixed, now I can maintain the car. So does that mean that after you have all this work done that the car is going to break less? No. Stuff's still going to go wrong. I mean, as much as I slam my head against the wall trying to find everything that can go wrong, like recently we just finished a 560 SEC, or almost finished it, and I'm going down the road with the lights on. And by the way, I do all my test driving with the lights on, not only because it's safe, but because I'm waiting for a light to fail. Because if the harder and longer you run them, the better you're going to find any weak bulbs. You know, the speedometer just quit working on the car, just stopped. If I had shipped this car back to where it lives, which is about 5 hours away, it would probably mean that I'd have to make a trip down there and deal with it, you know, because, you know, the funny thing is you have these when people have their cars worked on and sorted here, they have this very high expectation that nothing is ever going to go wrong. So I have to meet that expectation. And when you're spending so much money, it's actually a reasonable expectation, but it still means that there's a 10% chance you're going to have a problem. Maybe not a big problem, but, you know, a little problem, you know. But we have a lot of customers that'll say after they've had their car sorted out, they'll get really wound up about sometimes past issues that are not fully resolvable unless you know, gut the entire car, but no oil changes. Sorry, you know, we're just going to write that off. You know, and you think that having a classic car, especially a maintenance intensive car like a Mercedes Benz, you'd say, okay, I don't want to have to go through X number of major repairs again, so I'm just going to change my oil on time, learn how to do it myself. Why not? And in fact, with every customer, I tell them how to change their own oil. Whether or not they choose to do it is their business, but I want them to do it because the chances of it going wrong if you take it to another shop are quite high as well. So what is a 30-year cycle of neglect? Well, the 30-year cycle of neglect consists of three major components. One, items that have broken and never gotten addressed. Two, items that have broken and never got addressed properly, or items that have broken and the mechanic was just like, I'm too scared, too unknowledgeable, too busy, too lazy, too physically challenged to fill an excuse to address those problems. Or number three, they're maintenance items that just never got done ever, period, which is why we get so many cars that have grease fittings where the front suspensions have to be taken apart because nobody ever spent the 30 to 45 minutes every 6 months greasing them. It really isn't that much time. Number four, items that broke that nobody knew about because nobody inspected their car regularly. And then number five, items that slowly, maybe they didn't fail all at once, but they slowly get worse. You know, like a front suspension bushing on a 123, like a lower control arm bushing, or a turbocharger that slowly starts to leak oil. It happens so slowly that it makes grass growing look fast. You know, but typically, if something can fail, it's going to fail in a 30-year cycle. And if it's good, it's probably not. That's why I tell people that if their engine is strong and healthy and has been consistent over the last 30 years, if they have that information, it's probably going to be consistent for the next 30. But if their transmission has leaks that have gotten worse over the last 30 years, they're probably going to keep getting worse. You know, and you may not have 30 years. You may just run out of fluid. Now, I recognize if you look at two 30-year cycles, it's about the, I'm not going to say that's about the driving life of an average human being now, but it used to be the driving life of an average human being. But what we see with Classic Mercedes is the cars are so unkillable because their major components tend to stay working that they go to their next 30-year cycle, usually with another family member or another owner. But we don't see as many 30-year cycles as we used to. What I'm saying is that the cars that are really well preserved, one or two family owned cars, are usually getting bought up and being bought, sold, traded, bought, sold, traded, bought, sold, auctioned off, traded, bought, sold, advertised, never sold, traded, auctioned, etc. in 2 to 3 year periods. And so what that does is it perpetuate certain things. Maybe one out of those 3 or 4 owners in those 2-year windows will fix some of the major things, but a lot of the major things, the majority of them just don't get addressed. And that's why we look at the 30-year cycle as sort of, maybe a lot of information gets lost in that period of time too. So you need to think of it this way. Anything that could fail in 30 years needs to be checked to make sure nobody either overlooked it or deliberately overlooked it to make sure it never got addressed. This happens both with owners and mechanics. So anyway, if you found this video useful, put your car on a lift or on jack stands and inspect it to see what is in the process of failing. 2, if there's a repair you've been putting off, try to stop putting it off and deal with it. Of course, I have room to talk. 3, if there's maintenance you've been putting off, quit putting it off. It's just like a diet. Nobody wants to do it, but you'll feel so much better after it's, done. And if you enjoyed this video or you have any great information for our subscribers, leave it in the comments below. And in the meantime, enjoy driving your Classic Mercedes. And we hope you subscribe to this channel because we could use a few more of you. Thanks.